Hey, it's J. T. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller. Here are los cuentos de Los Angeles. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller Podcast. Renee Rose, thank you so very much for joining me on this installment of JT the LA Storyteller Podcast, also known as Los Cuentos de Los Angeles. We are here today to discuss your candidacy for the Superior Court Judge seat 48. And I'm very glad to have you here. I've noted to you that I think it's important that voters know their choices out there and who we're speaking with. So this is definitely an opportunity to say more about where you're coming from. And actually, yeah, I'd like to ask you that first, your name, that is, as well as where you're speaking to us from.
My name is Renee Rose. I am running for Office 48 for Los Angeles Superior Court Judge, and I'm speaking to you from my home in Pasadena.
Now, Renee, would you tell me a little bit about what led you to declare your candidacy for the Superior Court Judge seat 48? Please tell me the backstory, and we'll get into a few more questions from there.
Well, I have been in the criminal justice system for 33 years as a prosecutor. I felt maybe in the last 4 or 5 years about maybe putting my efforts towards becoming a judge on the bench. I think in the most basic sense, when people come to court, there's always an important and consequential issue in their lives to be decided. And these issues, no matter what size, no matter what the possible consequence, are often personal. They could be hurtful, embarrassing, costly, frustrating, and really financially and emotionally draining. And there are sides, and there are resources that are taxed. Personal freedoms could be at stake depending on what courtroom you're in. And people need to feel like their issues should be heard. I feel, being in the court system for the last 33 years, I understand all of that from a variety of different perspectives. For myself as an early prosecutor, from the work that I do now, from everything in between, from being in hundreds of courtrooms. I worked both in Riverside County, and since 1994, I've been in Los Angeles County. So I have been before good judges, I have been before bad judges, and I understand how important this process is, that people need to get through it. And the way to get through it relies a lot on the judge. And it can really cause additional trauma to people if you are not transparent, if you don't do a good job, you don't do your work. As a judge, I think it's a hard job. I think you need to learn the law. And it is important for you to make those decisions. You're no longer an advocate. This job is about justice. It is about following the law. And it is about having sides that are able to be heard. And so I have had a fabulous career as an advocate. I have been a voice for victims in hundreds of courtrooms. And I have also worked for the last 7.5 years in the elder abuse unit, and where my victims are primarily the adult children of my defendants. My defendants are primarily the mentally ill, substance abusing, financially insolvent adult children or family member for my victims. My victims generally do not want their children to go to jail or to prison. What they want is for their children to get help. So I've been heavily involved in the evolution, if you will, of the alternative sentencing courts and shifting people out of the criminal justice system where it's appropriate, and getting them treatment, getting them housing, getting them wraparound services, social services, so that they don't go back and rely on the parent as a source of a place to stay and someone to live off of. And so helping that person move forward, something that the parent has always wanted. So I have always looked at this job as a prosecutor, it's a very, very global job and a lot like a judge. We do a lot of sort of a macro view of everything, right? We have to represent a victim and be a voice for that victim in court. We have to abide by the laws, abide by the procedures. We have to consider the safety of the community. We have to consider what would be the best alternative for a defendant, whether that is going to be an incarceration path, whether that's an alternatives to incarceration path. Are there safeguards in place that this individual can go into the community, get the help the right help that they need? And then ultimately that makes the community a safer place. So those are all decisions prosecutors make every day on all of their cases. And that's a very macro view. As opposed to, say, someone who represents a defendant, that is a very micro view about what is best for that person. And that is something, because we represent the people, we also represent a defendant in the sense that we consider all of that. And at the very end of considering all of that, we have to come up with what would be justice. So I think I've been prepared over these 33 years to make the kind of decisions that a judge makes, stepping out of that advocacy role and stepping into the role of listening to the parties, making sure everyone feels that they have a safe, respectful place to be heard. And that I do my job and I know what the law is, I follow the law, and I help people move through this process of kind of being stuck in whatever court system they're in. And I think that's so important for people to lead better lives. And so I have given to my community. As a prosecutor, my daughter and I are members of the National Charity League. So that's where mothers and daughters do philanthropy throughout Los Angeles. So my 13-year-old and I, we do a lot for the San Gabriel Valley. We have Ronald McDonald House and Operation Gratitude and Cancer Support Services. And so I want my daughter to learn through my example the importance of giving back to a community in a meaningful sense. And so I think all of that has prepared me to do this next step, which is being a judge. Once again, a completely different job than what I had before, but I think I have the experience. I think I have the work ethic. I have the knowledge base and the commitment to be fair and impartial to everyone who is before me. So that's why I want to be a judge.
And to be sure, Renee, because as a prosecutor, as you pointed out, you are defending the law of the land. What I understand is that deterrence is a huge determining factor when it comes to prosecuting crimes that take place in any county, not just Los Angeles County. And so I can't help but ask you about your theory of deterrence, because I think that when I imagine a prosecutor's work, or when I recall witnessing prosecutors at their work in one courtroom or another for whatever reason, ensuring that those offenders, that those in violation of the law are reprimanded, and that they also essentially have to account in a considerable way for what harm they've caused, for what conflict or tension or issue they've created. I know that I've witnessed huge sentencing demands from the part of the court. And I know that this idea, or that the idea behind this, is basically to steer the public away from repeating that same error. And I have to ask you then about what your theory of deterrence is, and how you view that, especially over a career that has spanned 30 years.
Well, I think deterrence means different things for different people. So deterrence, depending on the person, and certainly the more information that a defense attorney brings to us, and the more information that we can learn, the better position we are to determine what is going to deter this behavior again, right? I think the criminal justice system has a very small percentage of people that are just evil and that have to be housed away from society. And a majority of the people have just made bad decisions. And so the question becomes, what is going to be impactful and meaningful to this particular person that would be a deterrent? So that could look like different things. When I was doing hardcore gang in the 1999s, 2000s, there was an incredible amount of drive-by shooting, and I was working in Compton, and it was happening daily, weekly, back and forth. Compton is about 5 square miles, and at the time they had 52 different gangs. And maybe each gang might claim 2 or 3 blocks of that 5 square miles. So it was really a rough time. And what gangs were doing is they were, people didn't have a chance. They were standing on the street and they were getting shot at. There was drive-bys. And so they were having younger gang members be the shooters, understanding that juveniles got treated lighter than adults did. And so there are groups of people out there who understand how the criminal justice system worked and manipulated the people who did those crimes in order to accomplish their goal. So the deterrence was really high. We came up with 3 strikes, and we came up ultimately with gang enhancements and gun enhancements. And gun enhancements, if you were in a gang and you were shooting at a rival gang member outside the car and murdered 2 or 3 people with those shots. So I think the law developed some deterrents that I think for a period of time were effective. And then there is the deterrent aspect of if you can help a mental illness, or you can help a drug addiction, and you can deter the reason why they're doing the crime, and we take that away from somebody because they become healthy and they can integrate into society. Some people thought it was a deterrence to have to go into treatment. They would prefer to go to jail than to have to go to treatment. So I think my theory of deterrence really depends on the individual and what has worked in the past, and what that individual needs. And I think now, in the later part of my career, I think the district attorney's office and society is more prepared and willing to address those issues more in a head-on sense, in the sense that there are programs out there. So it depends. I don't know that I have a one-liner to say what deterrence is, but for each person, that is going to be something. And what we hope to do is to fix the problem and have that person not come back into the criminal justice system. So if that means that they're afraid of going to prison, then there are going to be those crimes that have a potentiality of prison. I mean, there are people who should go to prison for the crimes that they do. If it is something they can be on probation for, but they could go to prison, that's when we start to determine, okay, is probation going to be a significant deterrence if we do these other things? And so sometimes community service is a deterrence. It's a long time to be picking up trash on the side of the road. So.
Right. And so, I mean, it sounds to me like what you're saying as well is that if you look at it kind of as an anthropological question, kind of as a timeline almost, there are things which worked previously, or certain responses which were effective previously, that are maybe no longer applicable because the times have changed, because in 30 years, the landscape has changed. You mentioned Compton at the outset, and the number of drive-by shootings, and in a 30-year span, violent crime, not just in Los Angeles County, but across the country, has actually shrunk year by year. And I think property crime has seen a different kind of oscillation, but for the most part, violent crime has been certainly scaled down from what it was in the 1990s. And I can't help but ask you just as well about what your theory is when people note that, hey, a part of the problem that we're currently looking at is the criminal justice system and its sort of modus operandi when it comes to sentencing people and then failing to rehabilitate them. Part of the problem then is people who spend years of their lives behind bars and then make their way back out into society without many skills, who face discrimination in housing and certainly employment opportunities. And so I have to ask you what you make of that notion as someone who works in the system. What do you make of the idea that, hey, part of the problem is the institution is sort of just working on autopilot and sending too many people behind bars as it is? Our jails are overcrowded in Los Angeles and in California. So what do we do to respond to that in your view?
Well, I think there should be more programming for sure in state prison. That is a monetary thing. That is the governor providing more money to a state prison system to allow for education, to allow for treatment in prison. There are programs in prison, and people do have the ability to do them. Some choose not to. The legislature a few years ago decided to incentivize people and say, if you do some of these programs, you'll get out early. And that brought more people to treatment. That brought more people wanting to take advantage of those programs. So I think more money needs to be funded into a prison system where people have the opportunity and are still incentivized to do these types of things. I think that the jail system is not a place where much treatment can happen just by the nature of people moving in and out of the system. I do believe that we have to have better programming out there for people who get out of prison, more opportunities for them. But I also think we need to have better programming to stop from going to prison in the first place, right? The criminal justice system shouldn't be the place where mentally ill people get treatment, but we are, because we don't have very many tools out there for people to get mentally ill, drug addicted people into treatment on their own. And so someone commits crime, now the criminal justice system's involved. And now we do what other people were not able to do, which is get someone incentivized to go into treatment, and to not just go into treatment, but stay in treatment, because there's a lot of pieces to going to treatment. So I think the criminal justice system, because we lost these mechanisms in society to, involuntary commit people, the criminal justice system has picked up that job. I think everyone can do it better, but we lack resources, and we lack money, and we lack manpower. And we need to address these issues when kids are in school. So we need more counselors in school and more psychologists in school so that they don't grow up and feel like they don't have other alternatives. So there's so many parts of society that we have to really have the political will to commit to give them the resources, right? Everyone's fighting for resources, but we have to be smart about it, and we have to check and make sure people are doing a good job when they do get that money.
Yeah. And actually, you and I spoke previously about exactly this point, right? Stories about funding programs out there, only to find out or to see them on A1 of the Los Angeles Times somewhere, being called out for the fact that funds were misappropriated, that promises were unkept, that housing which needed to be built and rehabilitative programs which also needed to be established were never so. And so I think a part of what you're describing here is also this form of catch up, because it's like we have to catch up now as a city, as a county, as a state, with the dearth of mental health resources and programs for folks. And just as you said, Now, the only place that so many different people can access these resources is inside. And even then, we have another battle out in front of us. But on that note, I would be remiss to not ask you about care courts and what may be coming up in the years ahead for care courts. Because I think if you live in Los Angeles County, even as you and I spoke, we had an encounter that was very emblematic of the state of Los Angeles in 2024 when it comes to the mental health crises and the lack of housing on such a large scale, especially for those suffering from serious mental trauma. The care court system is a response to that, in that, hey, like, at least from what I understand so far, people will be required to face an assessment and, if possible, to be essentially committed to some form of housing that is also attached to mental health resources. I'm wondering what you would make of this as a judge at the Superior Court in the years ahead, because care court has been established, the law passed very narrowly over the last year. And so I'm very curious about your take on this.
Well, I'd like to see maybe some statistics from care court. I'm not sure how, if they're ready yet to have had statistics come out. I know they're up and running in Norwalk. I think the idea of care court is a great idea. So family, friends, first responders, mental health practitioners in the community petitioning the court for somebody who is suffering from significant mental illness so that they can get into a care court program. And then the judge is going to assign counsel to that person. And they are going to have these court hearings, and you will have this person to advocate for you. And you will have social workers and a place to live and get treatment. And that is all great. The issue that I see is that oftentimes when people are suffering from mental illness and drug addiction, they make terrible choices about their life, and particularly someone in significant mental health distress. So asking someone in significant mental health distress if they voluntarily want to go into this program, and then they will voluntarily need to stay in the program, because there really isn't a mechanism to force someone to stay. So I would be interested to know if people are staying in the program voluntarily, because that would be phenomenal. It's just been my experience with people in the criminal justice system that while they're facing something in court, they're like, yes, I'll go to treatment. And then they go out to a program, and maybe a week later they walk out the front door. These are not locked programs, right? So they leave. And then eventually they're back either voluntarily or they've had an arrest warrant issued, and they're back before us again saying, I really, really, really want to do this again. But I feel like a piece of that is because they are facing potential incarceration, and they're choosing treatment as the better option for themselves rather than incarceration. But if you don't have something to incentivize people when they're in the throes of mental illness, I think it might be difficult to get people into this program. I think there's a lot of well-meaning intent. There's a lot of thoughtfulness behind what this program could be. But we also have to be mindful of just what a mental illness does to people. And so I think it would be interesting to be a judge in this court. I would like to know what tools would be available to help people until they can start to make those better decisions themselves. So those are kind of my thoughts on care court.
Yeah, and what an interesting moment, right? I mean, if it were 1994, we would be talking about, once again, these drive-by shootings, as you pointed out, and families standing in harm's way. In 2024, we're talking about a city and a county and a state dealing with an unprecedented housing crisis, which has affected the severely mentally ill and those experiencing the greatest trauma more than any other, but which is not relegated to that either, because there are so many people experiencing housing insecurity and housing instability. And so this is also something that informs the way we conduct ourselves in our everyday lives, as you can probably tell, and as you've probably seen in your cases. I imagine that there's been a lot in terms of housing. In fact, you mentioned that when it's come to elderly residents in the unit that you oversee, much of it has to do with their having no other place to live except for a family member who may not be the best choice for them for one reason or another, right? So even in that regard, housing is a crisis, and it really tells you a lot about just how vast the dirt is when it comes to just a basic living resource for people every day in Los Angeles County and in the state of California, actually.
Yeah, I mean, these are tough political decisions that need to be made, hopefully by those people in politics. You know,
Right. And of course, as a judge, you are there to oversee the law and to see that it is applied equally and fairly. Absolutely. Now, to be certain, I want to ask you a little bit about your career once again, and essentially what you've learned, not just from those whom you've defended, but also from those who you've prosecuted. What is an area of growth or something that has surprised you over such a storied career, if you will?
I think sort of my growth track, I came out of law school and became a prosecutor for Riverside County. Different county. I was out in Coachella Valley, which is like Palm Desert, Palm Springs area. A much smaller office. If there was a murder, we all sat around a table and discussed the crime scene and possible theories. And whereas I can't even imagine that in a county as large as Los Angeles. But so I learned as a prosecutor from a victim perspective. There was a lot of trauma that went with being victimized, and sort of feeling like they had to be informed of what was going on. And it's a frustrating system to have things continued, and sort of not have what I call closure. And I'm sure there's people that never get closure. But to feel like a voice was heard and that justice was done, because that's ultimately what victims want. And they don't often know what justice feels like to them. So my perspective, I think, when I first became an attorney was making sure that I was a respectful advocate for that and for all that they went through. And then as I went on, I learned the trauma happens in a lot of different areas, and the defendants are filled with trauma from various things in their lives, and that paints their reality, and that sometimes directs their choices based on that trauma. And so it became a much more global picture for me to find justice. Justice wasn't just a voice of a victim. It was also an understanding, and this is pretty early on in my career, an understanding that there was this other piece of trauma that needed to be addressed in a meaningful way. And so trying to come to something that created that, and learning that there are programs out there. Oftentimes prosecutors don't know what's available as an alternative. And there were times there weren't alternatives. And that wasn't an option for someone you knew was obviously traumatized and obviously struggling with mental illness. We did not have these options. But now that we do have these options, we need to determine what's the best option for the person. It's not, oftentimes it's about, sometimes for a defendant, it's not about, well, I need a year in treatment. It's about, well, what's the least amount of time I can do? What's the best deal I can get? And that's their perspective. What's best for me? And I have to look at a more global sense. What's best for the community? Does that mean it's something longer or shorter? So in a sense, it became a more macro view. And then I was also involved in a family court dispute with my husband as a litigant, really as a witness. And I was in the civil family court world. And from the perspective of somebody who has a case, I learned a lot about how important a good judge is. Because now I'm looking at it not from somebody close to the judge talking to him and someone who feels very powerless sitting and waiting for a case to be called, but I am that powerless person waiting for a case to be called. And so the delays, it was maddening. And it really put our family on hold emotionally until the certain decisions could be made. And that caused us trauma. And so I personally experienced what it felt like to sort of be in the hands, if you will, of the judge and the decisions that were made and how they shaped our case. And then as working in elder abuse, I also collaborate with other courts. So the probate court, the ones that handle conservatorships and guardianships and wills and trusts, because that often crosses into my path. And a lot of talking with civil judges. Civil lawyers about their cases in civil court, which have crossover because family members tend to sue each other in civil court over their parents' wealth. And so I have seen a judge's job from various perspectives, a much more broader perspective. And I have experienced the distress. I've experienced the anguish of waiting for decisions, and knowing that impacts your life. I think that's an important thing, that you have stood in someone's shoes. And I have that piece that I think will be so important for me going to the bench. So the growth, I think, of everything I've experienced as a prosecutor and what I'm doing now and what I experienced in civil court has led me to believe that I have exactly what it takes to be a judge.
Well, and because we have spoken so much about growth and changes in one's perspective and changes in one's approach from there on, I want to ask you what you make of the Prosecutors Alliance of California, whose stated purpose is to see preventative programs and community-based responses to crime in our cities and across the state. What do you make of that? More community responses and more preventative programs rather than punitive measures and kind of that old theory of deterrence that we were thinking about, especially at the top of our conversation?
Well, I first heard about Prosecutors Alliance, I want to say maybe in 2020 when George Gascón took over the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. Before then, I had never heard of them. And so they provide training to us sort of in their, I guess they have their reformative justice system, and that's the training that they provide us through that lens, if you will. And that is an important lens to look at training. But I don't think that's the only lens out there, but it is certainly an important one. And some of their programs that I agree with, and I don't agree with all of them, but they want change. And I smile a little bit because we were doing this before 2020. Before George Gascón came to Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, Jackie Lacey was one of the most progressive prosecutors in the nation. And so she had established Office of Diversion and Reentry. She had established Veterans Court, Women's Court. So these courts were established previously. What the Prosecutors Alliance, I think, brings to that discussion is the lens at which to view trauma in all instances. Trauma faced by, say, a juvenile and what brought a juvenile into the juvenile justice system, trauma for victims, trauma for in various circumstances. And I find that training fascinating, because I have seen trauma throughout my career. I think, like I said, I think it's a great opportunity to get that training, to get implicit bias training, because that's not something that's easily offered out there. And so it brings to us different people throughout the country. Oftentimes when we have training, it's someone throughout California that is training us. Through the Prosecutors Alliance, we have trainers from various states. And so that's a much broader perspective, I think, than what we get. So I think it's important training. I think they have great topics. And I think it's incumbent upon us as prosecutors to get as much training as we can from all the sources that are out there. And sometimes our options, the California District Attorneys Association provides training as well, but it is not something necessarily that our office promotes. So I think the more voices you hear, the more different perspectives you are exposed to, the better you do your job. So I think in that sense, Prosecutors Alliance gives us an incredible amount of information on stuff that we have not been trained in necessarily before. And it's important, and very important in that sense.
Of course, of course. And just because you mentioned Jackie Lacey, I can't help but ask, because you referred to her as one of the most progressive DAs in your time within the field. I can't help but think about Jackie Lacey's sort of infamous refusal to prosecute police officers for shooting bystanders in the city of Los Angeles, which has one of the highest shooting rates for residents by police in the nation, right? So that would certainly complicate the claim, complicate things for the claim that Jackie Lacey was one of the most progressive DAs, right? I mean, George Gascón got into office because a huge part of his campaign noted that, hey, we were going to take a more comprehensive look at these cases, and where it was merited, prosecute police, right? So I just wanted to sort of clarify the air there when it comes to how we define progressive, and also how one community may define that rather differently from another, to be certain.
Well, I don't know, I'd call it an error, but so maybe of more. So George Gascón has been in office for 4 years. How many police officers has he prosecuted that Jackie Lacey declined prosecution on?
Very few.
None.
Yeah, his office, yeah.
None. So here's the issue. The issue is when Jackie Lacey was in office, and these cases went through a wide range of review, and all of those reviews were posted on the internet. So anyone could see the reasons why the district attorney's office felt that there wasn't evidence sufficient to, because our standard at the time of filing is beyond a reasonable doubt. Not, I'm going to file this charge and maybe it's going to get better, but I believe I can convince 12 people in the community beyond a reasonable doubt that this person is guilty from the moment we file charges. That's our standard. So when that standard couldn't be met on cases, Jackie Lacey posted all of those decisions, all of those rationales for everyone to see. I don't recall specific cases. George Gascón hired an attorney, an outside attorney, to come in and review the cases that Jackie Lacey office declined. And that was 4 years ago. And have you seen a case come through? And what that says to me is that there was a determination made by several people that the district attorney's office did not have enough evidence, and I don't know specific cases, so I'm just making a general statement here, that the district attorney's office did not have specific cases, did not have the specific evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the standard that the officers had to use deadly force was not met. And so I understand that people were very frustrated by that.
Right. I imagine that you do understand that very well, right? I mean, you were talking
Yeah.
about civil litigation earlier, right? Where it
Yeah.
was just one delay after another. And yet here, where people are having family members taken out by those who are supposed to uphold the law and oversee fairness and community for us, to see that the DA's office can find not a single case in which there is enough evidence to prove without reasonable doubt that a police officer was in fact responsible for the death of a family member or a loved one. That's also just a high sort of, that's an anomalous statistic, right? I mean, a situation in which you can find exactly 0 cases where that's merited, that's really high, right? But we could talk about that sort of ad infinitum. I mean, it is a lengthy discussion, and we can continue in that respect. But I just wanted to essentially look at that a little more closely with you, because these are the questions that inform courts and court systems every day in Los Angeles County, just as well. Actually, how do you apply the law and let a community know, or make a community feel like their voices have in fact been heard, rather than the opposite? That is what our justice system is supposed to be.
And from someone who's inside the justice system, and we have a duty, right? Our duty is we have to be able to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. That's 12 strangers in the community guilty. That's the highest standard under law. So it's a different situation if you take a civil case and you civilly sue a law enforcement officer and they have 51%, than it is the highest standard under the law beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's a good part of what this issue is. Can we, if we take these cases and we give them to the community and we believe we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, are we successful in doing so? Are we successful in prosecuting police officers? So I think, and I want to correct myself, I think Mr. Middleton has 1 case now that he just went to grand jury on. But there were certainly several of these cases that were out there under review. My only point being that it's a very difficult standard in light of what the standard is for police officers. And so it makes it difficult whether or not we can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And those are the decisions that are made.
Right. And clearly it is difficult because even George Gascón's office, as you pointed out, has had about 3.5 or so years to oversee and review some of these cases. And there's been a very small, a very small difference. Clearly there is a high standard to meet on everyone's part. And it is incredibly difficult work, if not the most difficult work, for someone in the Superior Court justice system in Los Angeles County, right? Overseeing justice for families and communities on a comprehensive level, which is what we've certainly talked about today in so many different respects. And because we are reaching the close of our discussion today, though I'd be happy to speak more with you at some point, by all means, I do have to ask you to make one final pitch, given the closeness of the election. Because ballots need to get to mailboxes a little over 30 days ahead of election day. I think we're just about going to reach that this weekend. If not, very early next week or this time next week, voters will have the chance to check off this ballot. So what is your final pitch to the voters of Los Angeles County for the Superior Court Judge Office, seat 48, Renee?
Well, I have spent 33 years of my life serving this community. And I have been in as we've talked about, in the hardcore gang unit in Compton. I have been in the juvenile division. I have been in the major narcotics division, where I was going after people who manufactured methamphetamine and PCP. I was one of two specially assigned prosecutors to the arson and explosives unit. And for the last 7.5 years, I've been in the elder and adult abuse unit. And I just want to comment a little bit about my work that I do in that particular unit. I've talked a little bit about it, but I think there was a comment that I'm not in trial very often. So it's all of the things I do in my unit. So I supervise my 7 DAs and my support staff. I carry a caseload of 20 to 25 cases that require either restitution hearings, probation violation hearings. I monitor people who go into these alternative sentencing courts. I handle people who've been found not guilty by the reason of insanity. And when they come back from state prison, they may want a motion to restore their sanity to get back into society. I handle expungement petitions. So people who have had convictions and have been successful in their probation and they're asking for that to be expunged. I do handle those. I notify the defense if there is bad information, what we call Brady information, on law enforcement officers, so that they have that preparation. I manage grant funding and do reports and all of this stuff. I'm part of multidisciplinary teams that work with public guardian's office and law enforcement and prosecutors and social workers and doctors to help seniors and developmentally disabled adults live better lives, help them out of the problems that they're in. I train law enforcement, I train colleagues, I train social workers on elder abuse and how best to serve these victims. And I go out into the community and I talk to seniors about what elder abuse looks like, feels like, who to report it to, and how to report it, because it's a wild world out there. And information is power, and people need that to make decisions. And so I'm also the co-head of the Elder Death Review Team, along with the Los Angeles County Coroner, where we review elder deaths to make sure we didn't miss anything. So oftentimes with this group of victims, there's a lot of things wrong with them at the end of their life, but their death may have been caused by neglect. And so we take a deeper dive into those cases. And ultimately, what the LA County Bar said, they found me well qualified. And I think the highest rating goes to judges who are already judges. That's exceptionally well qualified. They found me well qualified because the committee believes you possess the professional ability. I'm reading this now, if you can't tell, experience, competence, integrity, and temperament indicative of superior fitness to perform the judicial function with a high degree of skill and effectiveness. They have looked at my career. My colleagues at the LA County Bar Association have done a deep dive into my career and the cases I've tried and the cases I have handled, and they have found me well qualified to be judge. I have 33 years of experience. I think we have to we need to promote more women, but that's not going to help you with the choice in my race. But we need to promote the best person. I am not financed by a PAC. I do not have like-minded services provided to me. I am funded by my family and my friends and my colleagues and people in the community that believe in me. And I have 50 judges that support me and endorse me. And I have a wide range of endorsements, from the Teamsters to law enforcement to Democratic clubs to I'm trying to think who else is that.
We'll refer people to your website so that they can
please
see.
do, because
We'll refer folks to your site.
I think it's really important. And on my website, you'll see the things that I do for the National Charity League and the things I do out in the community, because it's important to not just say that we're community involved, but to see that we are community involved. And so I feel like I'm the best candidate for this race. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're so welcome. And I'm so happy that I could facilitate this discussion for the voters, because civic engagement is my jam and I want to see more of it where I can. And this is very much in service of that, Renee. So I have to thank you immensely right back, because it's been a pleasure speaking with you. And I actually look forward to catching up with you again before too long, maybe even in Pasadena at some point, because these are the cities that we make up, and there is so much to consider in the days ahead and with the challenges that we have made mention of. So I can't wait for the voters to listen to this episode and go from there on. There are so many things on the ballot this year just as well, this November just as well. So I don't want voters to miss the Superior Court judge office seats. And you have just helped me make the case for them that this is just as important as every other election, if not more. So thank you once again, Renee, for your time today.
Thank you.
Hey, it's J. T. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller. Here are los cuentos de Los Angeles. Also known as JT the LA Storyteller Podcast.